Hey, what's going on, guys? So today we have our second guest post on the channel, and it's from Kyle from the Dev Simplified Channel. And his channel grew really fast in a really short amount of time, and with good reason, because he has a ton of great content, everything from beginner HTML, CSS videos to full stack JavaScript, does a lot of React, he does full projects, he does tips and tricks videos. So definitely check his channel out. I'll have the link in the description. And today what he's going to do is build a React application from scratch, and he's going to use the GitHub Jobs API. So be able to fetch jobs, be able to filter, search, implement pagination. So if you're into React, I think you'll really like this project, and he'll tell you more about it. So let's get into it.
Before we dive into this project, I want to give a huge thank you to Brad for letting me on his channel, because he was a huge influence for me when I was learning web development, and also a huge reason why I decided to start my own channel teaching web development, and I'm absolutely honored to be able to post on his channel. Now, jumping into what you're actually here for, the project, in this video, we're going to build out this GitHub Job API you see over here. You see we have a listing of all of these different jobs. These are all jobs that GitHub has on their own GitHub Jobs page. From over here, we stick all jobs. You see we have this listing of jobs. It's kind of ugly. So we've refreshed this, made it look a little bit nicer. We also have searching capability. So I could say like Nebraska, for example. And as you can see, this is the only job available posted on this API that's from Nebraska. And overall, we're just going to be making this nice clean design using the API that GitHub has available, which has the documentation right here. And we're going to be doing this using React. So to get started, I ran npx create React app to give us boilerplate React code. And I just deleted out all the testing and CSS files that we don't need and just left us with this single H1 that says hello world. And if we come over here, you can see we have that single hello world right here. So we have just a blank canvas to get started with. Now, the very first thing that I want to do is download the libraries that we're going to use to create the application you see here. So let's just come over here, create a new terminal tab, type in npm I, and we're going to need two different libraries. We're going to need axios, which is going to allow us to call the API we're using. And then we're also going to use React bootstrap. And this is just to make styling easier for us. As you can see, we have all these bootstrap looking styles over here. So it's just going to make it easier for us to get up and prototyping this design on the right-hand side of the screen that you see here. And now that that's finished downloading all of our different packages, we can finally jump into actually doing the work that we need to make this design. If I come over to this API and just zoom this in a little bit, because it's really small, hard to read text, you can see that this is just the GitHub Jobs API, and it has pretty poor documentation, but in essence, this get route down here is what we want. It has our URL for getting these different jobs as JSON, and it's just going to return to us a huge JSON dump of all of these different jobs. So if we paste this, you can see we're getting a huge dump of all these different jobs, all the information we need. And as you can see, we have some parameters such as description, location, and then up here, we also have a page parameter we can use because this is actually a paginated API. So the very first thing I want to do is actually to write the code that's going to call this API for us, because that's kind of the core of our entire application. And instead of writing that inside this app component here, I'm going to create a custom hook for that. So we're going to create a new file called usefetchjobs.js. This is going to be our hook, which is going to get all of our different jobs. And we just want to make sure we export a default function. And this is just going to be usefetchjobs. And inside of here, we're going to take some parameters. Our first parameter is just going to be a list. This is an object of all of our params, so description, location, full-time, etc. Then we're also going to have another parameter here, which is going to be for our page number that we're currently on. Now inside of the code, we actually need to do a bunch of work to actually call the API, save all of our different state, and return the information that we need to the user to say where we are. But before we do any of that, let's go into our app and import that component. We can say import usefetchjobs from /usefetchjobs. So now we have access to that custom hook. And down in here, we can call that usefetchjobs. We're going to pass it parameters, and we're going to pass it a page, for example, page 1. For now, we're just going to leave this completely blank. We're not actually going to pass anything into here. And what we want to do is say some variable is going to be equal to this. Like we need to figure out what information do we want to get from this hook here. And when we're calling the API, we're going to have a few different states. We're going to have all of the list of jobs, essentially this giant JSON dump. So we're going to have our jobs being returned. We're also going to have a loading state because while we're calling the API, we're going to be loading the application. So we're going to have a loading state. And then we're also going to have an error state in case for some reason our request fails and we're not actually able to make the request. We want to have some form of error state printed out to the user. So let's come in down here and actually print out those different states. We're going to do this inside of a container from Bootstrap. So we can just say import container, which is a here element that we can use from React Bootstrap. We can say React Bootstrap. We have this container component, and we can just say container like that. And now everything we put inside of container here is going to be inside of a Bootstrap div that has the class container, essentially. So we can say, for example, if we are loading, then we want to just have an h1, which is just going to have the text of loading. Let's do a similar thing for error, but this h1, instead of saying loading, is just going to say error, try refreshing. There we go. And then lastly, we're going to have our actual jobs. For now, we'll just say jobs.length. We're just going to print out how many jobs we have to the page. Let's just put that inside of an h1 as well. And this is just temporary, so we can actually see what's going on. Make sure we put that inside of the curly braces here. We don't need these outside ones. So that's just our basic code. And now we have our jobs, loading, and error being returned from this useFetchJobs. So inside of here, if we were to return something, for example, an object where we set jobs equal to an empty array, loading to false, and error to false, we should see 0 being printed out to our app because we have 0 jobs in the list. If we set loading to true, whoops, true, and save, you can see it says loading here. And if we set error to true, and we change this down to false, for example, you can see we get error try refreshing, and we still have that job length being printed out as 0. If we put some jobs in here, for example, just some random numbers, we'll get 3 because there's 3 jobs in this list. So really basic code, everything we have so far is hooked up and working properly. Now the next thing that we need to do is actually make this useFetchJobs hook do something, because obviously returning this static object is pretty useless. So let's come in here, we're going to import useReducer. We're going to import this from React. We're going to use this reducer here to handle all of the different state inside of our useFetchJobs. So we can just say const state, and dispatch is going to be equal to that useReducer. And this reducer is going to take a function, which is our reducer function, and it's going to take an initial state. And by default, our initial state is going to just be an object here. We're going to have an empty array of jobs, and we're going to have loading be set to true. Because by default, we're going to be loading our object at the beginning, just like that. If I expand my screen a little bit, you can get that all on one line. And now we have our state and our dispatch and our default state. We just need to create this reducer function. So we can say function reducer, and this is going to take in a state and an action. And essentially what happens with a reducer is this reducer function gets called every time we call dispatch. And dispatch, whatever we pass to it, is populated inside of this action variable, and state is just whatever our current state of the application is. So if we were to, for example, say dispatch, and we set this an object that had a type of hello, and we, for example, had a payload, which had a value for x of 3, now inside of here, we would have action.type, which would be equal to hello, and we would have payload.x, and that would be equal to 3. So essentially, whatever we pass to dispatch goes into action, and then our state is obviously just our state. And a common convention is to set a type for our different values, our different actions we can perform, and then payload is the data for that type. So in order to define all of our actions, we're going to create just a constant variable called actions, and this is going to be set to an object which defines our actions so that we can reference them later. So inside of this useFetchJobs, we have a few different things we can do. We can make a request. So we'll just say, set that to the string make request. Another thing that we can do is get our data. So when our request finishes, it's going to get our data from that request. So we can have get data, which is just going to be the string get data. And then the last thing we can do is if we have some form of error. So we're going to have a state called error with the string error. And these are the 3 different actions that we can perform on our state. And now in our reducer, we can just set up a simple switch statement based on our action.type. And inside of this switch statement, we can do a different switch for each one of our actions. So actions, oops, if I can type today, actions.make request. And then we can do some kind of stuff in here. We can have another case, which is going to be for actions.get data. And then we're finally going to have a case for actions.error. And then lastly, we're going to have a default. And this just says if we pass in an action type that we don't have inside of our list, we're just going to return our current state. We're essentially not going to update anything. Now, when we're making a request, we need to return a new state. And this state is actually just going to be a hard-coded value where we set loading to true, and our jobs is going to be set to an empty array. So every time we make a new request, we essentially say that we're loading and we clear out all of the jobs that we currently have. Now, when we're getting data, we're going to be a little bit different. We're going to take everything that's in our current state and put that in our new state, but we're also going to come in here, change loading to false, and then we're going to need to set our jobs to something. So we can say jobs is going to be equal to action.payload.jobs. So we're going to pass our jobs in on the payload of our action and set that inside of our action.getData. Now for our actions.error, this is going to be, again, very similar. We're going to take our current state, we're going to spread that out over the entire thing. We're going to set loading to false, and our error is just going to be action.payload.error. So we're going to pass our error object in, and then lastly, we don't want to have any jobs, so we're going to clear out our jobs if we have an error. So that's all of the different actions taken care of. Now we can work on writing the code to actually call these different actions. So let's clear this out. And what we need to do is every time we change our parameters, so for example, anytime we change one of these fields up here, we need to reload our page like this. Or if we change our page number, so if we go back here and we actually click one of these arrows to change our page number to, for example, page 2, you can see that we need to repopulate our data. So anytime we change page or params, we need to run our code again. And the best way to do that in React is using the useEffect hook. So we can get this useEffect hook. Come down here, say useEffect, which is going to take in a function, and then our parameters, the things that we want to happen. So whenever these things that we pass to this array change, for example, whenever our params or our page change, then we want to rerun this useEffect hook. Now inside of this hook, the very first thing we want to do is call dispatch, and we're going to call it with a type of makeRequest. So we're going to say actions.makeRequest because we're making a new request. And this doesn't take any type of payload, it's just a single type. And what that's going to do is it's going to update our state right here like we set it to do. So now that we've set our state to essentially our loading state, what we can do now is actually call axios. And since we need to make sure we import axios, let's just import axios from axios. And we can say axios.get. This is going to make a GET request to this GitHub Jobs API. And I'm just going to copy this URL here, this Jobs API, and I'm going to paste that into here. But instead of pasting it directly here like this, I just want to create a single variable for it. We're going to say base URL, and we're just going to set that here to this Jobs API. And then we can take this base URL and put it in here. This will just clean up our code a little bit. Now, once we have that, we need to pass it a bunch of options. The first option is going to be our params. In our case, we're going to pass it our parameters here. But we're also going to pass a couple extra parameters. For example, you can see here we can set markdown to true, and that'll return all of the different description fields and such that you see here with all these characters. It'll return them in markdown instead, which is going to be easier for us to work with. So what I want to do is I want to say markdown is going to be set to true. We also want to set our page equal to our current page number. And then lastly, we just want to take all of our current parameters and we want to put those inside of our params as well. So for example, description, location, and full time, that's what this params object is going to contain. And we're going to just pass all of those as our parameters. Now with that, we can call .then, and this is going to give us a response. And this response is going to have some form of data, res.data. And this is our list of jobs. That's this JSON right here that we get back from the API. And we can call that dispatch function. So we can say dispatch, and we're going to pass an object with a type. And our type is actions.get data. And we're going to have a payload here, which is going to have our jobs. And these jobs are just that res.data. So let's just copy that in like this. And now we essentially have made a action here. We're saying, okay, we got our data, so let's save our data to our state by calling the getData action. And then if we have an error of some time, we need to catch that. So we're going to come in here with our catch, and we're going to do a very similar thing, but instead of getData, we're going to be calling the error action. And instead of putting our data in here for our jobs, we're going to have error, which is just going to be equal to RE here. So we can store whatever error we got. Now, if we save this, we should have everything working to order to call that API. And now down here, we can return our state. Instead of returning something else, we're now just returning this state. And if we save, come over here, you're going to notice we get an error. And the reason for this error, if we inspect our page, go over to our console tab, you'll see that it says access to this URL from origin localhost has been blocked by cores. So we're running into a CORS issue. And this is generally really annoying to get around because you need a server to act as a proxy for CORS in order to get around CORS. But luckily there's a service that we can use in development in order to get around CORS that someone posted up on Heroku. And it's this URL, https://cors_anywhere.heroku.app. And essentially, if we just put this in front of our URL, it acts as a proxy for us, so we don't need to create our own proxy server, and it's actually going to get around CORS for us. So we'll just put that in front of our URL here. Now, if we save, and you see we get our loading state, and it's just going to be constantly loading until now it loaded, and we have 50 different things being returned because this API is paginated and it only returns 50 results at a time. So we now have the first 50 jobs inside of the jobs portion of our state here. Now that's great, but there's actually one problem with this code. It's a really minor problem. If, for example, our params change really quickly, we don't want to have a bunch of different calls to this API go out all at once and then come back all in different orders. So for example, over here, if I were to start typing in my location of Nebraska, I don't want to have tons of different axios requests going out there and being out there the entire time. I want it to essentially just stop making these different requests whenever I type in a new character. So whenever our params change, we want to cancel the old request. So in Axios, it's actually pretty simple to do that. We're going to create a cancel token, which is just going to be equal to axios.cancel token. And then we just need to say .source. And this is essentially going to get us a new cancel token we can use. And we can pass our cancel token here by saying cancel token.token to get the actual individual token itself. So now we have a reference to this Axios request inside of this cancel token. And now in order to clear that out, inside of our use effect, if we do a return down here, it'll run a function whenever we essentially change one of these values down here. It's going to run that to clean up our old code here. So now this function will be ran, and we can just take our cancel token and we can just cancel this by calling the cancel function. The only thing we need to worry about is when our request is canceled, it's going to call the .catch portion. So we need to check here to see if this is a cancel. So we'll say axios.cancel, is cancel, and we pass it the error. So essentially, if this was a canceled request, all we want to do is return here. This isn't actually a real error. This is us purposely canceling this. So we're going to ignore this error and only track errors that occur not because of canceling. And now if we save, we should still see loading and then 50. So everything is working as expected. Now the next thing to work on is back in our app. Now we need to actually pass in our parameters and our page. So we need to have some param here and some page. So let's just create state for that. We'll just import use state here from React. And we can say params, and set params. It's going to be equal to use state. We're just going to have that default to an empty object. And then we're going to have the same thing for page and set page. But we're just going to have that here be set to page 1 by default. So now if we save, hopefully everything works just the same as before, and you can see that it does. So now we can work on, instead of printing out our jobs.length, let's actually print out each individual job. So we can say jobs.map to loop through each one of our jobs. And now inside of here, all we need to do is return a job. Essentially, we need to return the HTML to render our job card, which you can see over here. And if we just clear this out, we can kind of see what a bunch of them look like, as you can see here. And this is actually fairly straightforward. We're going to create a new custom component for our job card. So we'll create a component which we're going to call job. And in this job component, we need a key because it's inside of a loop. So the key here is just going to be job.id. And then we're going to pass the job down like this. So now we have access to all of our job properties inside of our job. And we also have the key so that React knows how to properly render this. And if we save, we're going to, of course, get an error because we don't have a job component yet. So let's create that job component inside of our source. Create a new file called job.js. And I have an extension installed, which is called React ES7 Redux GraphQL React Native Snippets. It just allows me to type in here RFC and hit enter. And that's going to generate the boilerplate for a function component. You can type this all out by hand or download that extension. It's entirely up to you. So now with all of that done, we know that the only prop being sent into here is our actual job itself. And for now, all I want to do is just print out our job.title. This is essentially the title of the job we'll be getting, just to see if this is working. Now, if we save this, refresh, you're seeing that we're getting another error. It's saying job is not defined. That's just because we need to make sure we import job. So let's import job from /job. And now when we save, you should see we get a list of 50 different job titles based on the first 50 jobs inside of the API. And you can see that this actually lines up with the job titles over here. So now the next thing to work on is actually creating these different styles, because this is obviously very ugly. So let's make it look a little bit more like this over here, where we have each individual card. So inside of our job, we need to import some components from React, or from Bootstrap, I'm sorry. So we're going to import card just to get started from React Bootstrap. React Bootstrap. And this is going to be what we can use to create our card component. So instead of here having this div, we're going to trade this out with a card, just like that. And inside of our card, we're going to have a body. So we'll say card.body. And in the body is where we're going to put all of our different code for our card layout like this. Now, the very first thing we have is we have this left-hand side, which has all of this different information. And then just this right-hand side here has the image. As you can see, all of our card follows that exact formula where we have everything on the left and then the image on the right-hand side. So in order to do that, we're going to, inside of our body, create a div with a class name here of dflex. And we're going to just justify content between. And in this div, what we're going to do is on this first element inside of our div, we're going to put all of our content on the left-hand side. And the second part of our div, we'll put the image, and that'll space them out side by side, just like we want. So let's first start with our div, which will contain this left-hand side content. So we'll create a div here. And inside this div, we're going to need our title first. So we're going to say card.title. And inside of here, we're going to put this job title. So we're going to put our job title up there. And then inside of here, we're also going to put our code for this company as well. So we can just put a single hyphen here. And then we're going to create a span. And this span is going to contain all the code for making this a little bit lighter colored. So we can just say class name is going to be equal to text muted, font weight, light. And what this is going to do is essentially make this a slightly lighter color of text, and it's going to make it a less like bold font as well. So now we can just put the job.company in there, which is coming from that API. And if we save, come over here, you should see that now we have our information being printed out where we have our title and we have our actual company here. But you'll notice none of these Bootstrap styles are being applied. And the reason for that is we need to import Bootstrap into our app. And to do that, we're just going to go into our public folder here, our index.html. And if we go to the React Bootstrap page, you'll see that they have this link here we can just copy under how to use CSS to import Bootstrap. And if we just paste that into here, this is going to give us a reference to Bootstrap, which we can load in our page. And now when we save, come over here, you see that we have Bootstrap styles being applied. And you can see we have our cards, we have our different font weights, our titles, everything exactly like we want it. Obviously, spacing and everything is not quite right yet, but we're working on that. So now we can move on to styling the rest of our card. As you can see here, we have the next thing being our date. So let's go back into our job. We have our title done. So now we can move on to the subtitle, which is going to be our date. And inside of our subtitle, all we're going to do is print out a new date, which is our job.rated at. And unfortunately, this API uses underscores for everything instead of camel case. So it looks a little ugly in JavaScript, but that's just how the API is, and we need to deal with it. So we're converting this created at to a date, and then we're just going to convert that to a locale date string. This is just going to put this date as a string in whatever locale the current person viewing the page is looking at it in. So for me, since I'm in the US, everything is going to be month, then day. But for example, if you're in another country, it may say day, then month. And let's do a little bit of styling to get our text like we want it. So we'll come in here with a class name. We're going to say we want this to be text muted. We're also going to put a little bit of margin on the bottom to give us some space between this text and these little badges down here. Now if we save, come over here, we should get that date showing up. That's exactly like we want it. And now we can work on those different badges. And those are actually fairly straightforward. We're just going to use the badge component from Bootstrap. So let's import that badge component. And inside of this badge component, we just need to put our text. So the first thing we're going to have is our job.type. This is going to be full-time, part-time, or other things like that. And we're going to have another badge, which is going to be nearly identical, but this one is going to be for our location. So as you can see over here, we have, Bucharest, and we have New York City, Breda, and so on. So we have those different badges, and we want these badges to have a certain variant. So this is like primary, info, danger, warning. If you're used to Bootstrap, you're used to those different words. And for us, we're just going to use secondary for our variant, and we'll just copy that down to the other badge. Now if I save, come over here, you should see those badges populating, but they're right next to each other. I kind of want to space them out. So let's come on this first one. We're going to give it a margin on the right of 2, and that'll give us a little bit of space between these different badges, and that looks really good. Now the next thing we can work on is this how to apply link here. And this is actually sent to us in Markdown, because as you can see, these links are different across all of these different applications, and it's just marked down that the person making this job typed in themselves. We need some way to convert this Markdown to React code. And luckily there's a library we can install by typing in npm i called React Markdown. And then this is going to let us do is essentially convert this Markdown that we're getting sent from the API and converting it into React. So we just want to make sure we import that. So we can say import React Markdown from React Markdown, just like that. And now underneath this badge, let's just create a div. And inside of that div, let's put this React Markdown. And all this is going to have is a source. And this source is going to be equal to job.how-to-apply, again with underscores, unfortunately. And if we save, come over here, refresh our page, you should see that we now have these links showing up, but they're going way off the edge of our page. As you can see, we want these links to wrap if they go to the edge of the page like this, which is why we have this div. We're just going to give this here a style of word break. We're going to set that to break all. Now if we save, we should see that these wrap just like that, which is exactly what we want. Now this is everything that's going on the left-hand side of our card. Let's just kind of collapse this div to make it easier to see what we're working with. We're going to create another div, and this is going to be for the right-hand side. And we actually don't even need a div for this. We're just going to use an image tag here. We can just close off that image tag like this. This image tag is going to be for our company logo. So we can say that our source here is going to be equal to job.company underscore logo. And let's make sure we put an alt on this so people using a screen reader can read this. We'll just put the company name as the alt, so job.company, just like that. So now we have our alt tag as well as our source. And let's just put a couple different classes on here to make sure this doesn't show up on super small screens. So we're going to say class name is equal to d small none. This means it will be hidden on small screen sizes. And then we'll set d medium block, which means it's going to be shown on larger screen sizes. And then to make sure this image is never too big, we're going to set the height equal here to 50. And this should actually be extra small here. I'm sorry, not extra small, it should just be d none. That means it'll be hidden all the time, but on screen sizes medium and larger, it'll be shown. Now if we save this, we should see images showing up on the right-hand side here. And if we shrink down our screen size, you'll see that they disappear when it gets to the small size and the extra small size. But when we get large enough, you'll see the images pop back up, and it's never taller than 50 pixels, which is exactly what we want. Now, just going back up to the top here, what we can do is close down this complete div, since this is essentially all of our left versus right-hand content section. We can go down and we can work on our next little section, which is going to be this view details button, as well as the actual details of our job listing. So in order to create this button, we're going to wrap this in a card.text. This is essentially just a way to write text inside of our body. It's going to give us some nice spacing. And we're going to need to create a button. So we're going to import the button component from Bootstrap, just like that. And we close off this button, and this will just say view details for now. In this button, we also need to specify a variant for. In our case, we're going to use primary as the variant for our button. Now, if we save, go over here, we should see we have that view details button, which is exactly what we want. Now we can create our details section. Let's just create a div with a class name, which is going to be mt of 4. We're just going to put a nice large margin on the top of this section, so it'll space it away from our button. And then again, this description is in Markdown, so we're going to use React Markdown, pass it a source here, which is our job.description. Close this off. Now if we save, we should have our description showing up just like this. But obviously, clicking this button doesn't do anything. So we need to create the functionality for showing and hiding our button. And we can easily do that with the collapse component. So let's set this collapse component here, and we're going to wrap this entire thing inside of a collapse component. Let me just move that down. There we go. Now that's all inside the collapse component. And this is just going to take a single property called in, and we're going to set that to a variable called open. So when this open variable is true, collapse is going to be open. And when it's false, the collapse is going to be closed. And we can just use state for that. So we're going to say open and set open is equal to use state. And by default, we do not want this to be open. So let's make sure that we import use state just like that. And now everything should load just fine like it did before. There we go. And now we can work on setting our set open and our open, which is going to happen when we click on our button. So we can say here on click, what we want to do is just call a function, which is going to take set open. It's going to take our previous open, and it's essentially just going to invert that. So we'll say previous open. Let's just get this on a new line so it's easy to read. There we go. Just makes it a little bit easier to work with, like that. And now you can see just immediately by doing that, our details are collapsed. And we click view details, it'll show. And when we unclick, it'll hide them. But having this say view details the entire time doesn't really seem right. It should change from view details to hide details when we click on the button. In order to do that, we can just simply come in here and say if open is true, then we want it to say view details. Otherwise, if it's false, we want it to say hide details. And now, depending on the state of open versus closed, whoops, I have that backwards. This should be hide details if it's open, and it should be view details if it's closed, obviously. And now you can see view details, and when it's open, it says hide details. So we can toggle each one of these individually, and that's working exactly as we want. Now let's add a little spacing between our cards. We'll just come in here, say class name is going to be equal to margin bottom, let's say 3. That should give us some good spacing between our cards. That looks pretty good. And also, let's give a little bit of spacing on the top and down here, all the way on the bottom of our container. So what we can do is just say that we're going to have a class name on our container, which is a margin Y, and we'll just say maybe 4, for example. And that gives us a little bit of space from the top and the bottom of our container. So right now we have the basic shell of our application complete. So let's work on the next step, which is going to be our form input up here, as well as our pagination. And actually, before we get to that, let's add in this little nice title, which we can just put here, which says H1, GitHub Jobs. And also, we can change our background to this nice color. If we just go to the index, scroll down here till we find our body, just like this. We can set the class here to BG Light. And that's going to give us this nice little light background color to make our cards pop a little bit more. If we save our app here, we should get that GitHub Jobs showing up at the top as well. Also, let's space that out a little bit. Let's give it a nice class name here. We'll say MB of 4, just again to give it some space underneath for the loading and our cards to populate themselves. So now let's work on our pagination. So our pagination is going to be this list right here. We can just create a component for that. We're going to call it jobs pagination.js. And again, we could do that RFC trick to create the component. And here we're going to need our page that we're currently on, as well as a function for setting our page. And those are going to come inside of our props for this component. Now, luckily with Bootstrap, we have the ability to just use a component called pagination, just like this. And we're going to import that from React Bootstrap. And now instead of this div here, we can replace this with pagination. And this pagination component has things called pagination items, pagination previous, pagination next, which is going to give us all these nice little icons. So we can, for example, say pagination.previous, and this is going to give us the icon, which is going to be the left pointing back arrow. And if I just delete this real quick, save this, and in our app, we actually render that. So let's just make sure we put that here directly before our loading text. We'll say jobs pagination, that auto imported up here for us. And we need to import our current page into this. So we can just say page is equal to page, and set page is obviously equal to set page. We want to put this at the very beginning of our list and all the way at the bottom of our list. So we can save like this, and it's going to refresh. And you can see now we have that back arrow showing up at the top. And we also have the same back arrow showing up at the bottom. So we have this nice little back arrow, showing up exactly where we want it at the beginning and the end of our list. Now we can add in pagination, for example, which we'll do next. And this is going to give us the forward-looking arrow like that. And then obviously we need to have pagination for our different pages. So we can say pagination.item, and this is going to be an item. So we could say, for example, page, and this is going to be our current page. We could do page -1 to get our previous page, and we could do page +1 to get the next page. If we save that, you can see that looks like this. Obviously, it doesn't make sense to have a 0. So we want to have some checks in here, because if there's no previous page, there's no point in rendering this previous arrow. So we can say if page is not equal to 1, then we can render this. So essentially, if we're not on the first page, then we have a previous page, so let's render it. Same thing down here. We obviously don't want to render this previous page look if we already have a page of 1. So now if we save, immediately you see that 0 and that back arrow have disappeared, which is what we want. If we go back over to our other app, you'll notice if we go to, for example, page 2, we have that back arrow. If we go to page 3, you'll notice something else. We have this little ... section, which essentially lets us always jump back to page number 1. And this is actually pretty simple to do with Bootstrap. We have something called pagination.ellipsis, and that's going to give us that nice ... syntax. But we only want to render this ... if we're already on a page past number 2, because then we can jump back to number 1. What we're going to say here is if page is less than 2, or I'm sorry, greater than 2, then that means we're on a page after 2, so 3, 4, 5, and so on. So then we can render this ellipse. And also if our page is greater than 2, we want to render an item, and that item is going to just have 1 in it at all times. So close that off. And this is essentially the ability to go back to page 1 all the time. Now let's move this page -1 down to here. And we need to change around our if statements a little bit. So we only want to render this 1 if we're not on page 1 already. So this is not equal to 1, then we're going to render page 1. And here we only want to render the previous page if we're greater than 2, because we're already going to have 1 rendered up here. So if we're on page 2, this would have 1, then 2. So I can show you what that would look like if we just did not equal to 1, and I saved. And I came over here and we clicked on, for example, page 2, or if our page was 2, so let's just say, if I go to our app and I set our page to 2 by default, you'll see it says 1, 1, 2. And the way that we get rid of that is by just making sure that this is only shown when it's greater than 2. Now if I save, you can see we get that 1, 2, 3, which is exactly what we want. Let's of course go back to page 1 by default. And now the next thing that we need to do is to make sure we set this page right here as our active page. So we can just say active, and that's going to set it as active so we can see that we're currently on page 1. It does not let us click that, and we can only click all of these other page icons here. Also, something we need to do is to check to see if we have a next page. So we're going to have a variable called has next page. And if that is true, we're going to render this item for our next page. And we're going to do the same thing down here. We're going to say has next page. Then we're going to render this pagination.next. And the reason for all of this is that we don't want to render the next button if we're already on the last page. So now if we save and we input here has next page, we should see all those next icons are disappeared because we have not set this to true yet. But if inside of our app, we come down here to pagination, we pass has next page equals true to both of these different components, you'll now see that we have those next items showing up. So how do we actually calculate what the next page is going to be? Well, this is actually something we need to do inside of our use fetch jobs hook, because unfortunately this API doesn't actually tell us if there's a next page or not. We just need to manually check to see if there is another page, and if so, we need to update a variable that says so. So we need to add another action. This action is going to be for updating as next page. So we can just say update as next page. We can just say update has next page. And now inside of here, we can create another case, which is just going to say actions.update has next page. And we're going to return our state as well as next page. And we're going to set that equal to our action.payload.has next page. So we're just going to pass true or false whether there is a next page or not to this update action. So now let's actually figure out how we can use that action. Well, the easiest way to do it is essentially just do another Axios request for the next page and see if there are any results. I'm actually going to copy essentially all of this code. So we're going to create a new Axios request, but instead of page, we're going to go to page +1. And then if we have a successful result here, what we're going to do is we're going to update our has next page, and we're going to set the payload essentially equal to has next page. And it's going to be equal to if this data essentially exists. So if the data dot length is not equal to 0, that means that we have some data on the next page. So we do have a next page, so it'll be true. But if the length is 0, that means there's no jobs on the next page. So this is going to be false. We can still do the exact same thing down here with our error, but we need to create a separate cancel token for this because it's a separate request. So we're going to have up here cancel token 1, change this to cancel token 1, and cancel token 1. Now let's just copy this cancel token, and we'll do cancel token 2, and then down here cancel token 2 dot cancel. just so we have two different cancel tokens and we can individually cancel each one of these requests. So now we have this has next page inside of a state coming from use fetch jobs. And if we go over to our app and we just take that out here as next page, and now instead of just hard coding true, we just pass in that has next page variable and we save, you can see that it's going to load and it says that, oh, there is more information on page number 2, which is exactly what we want. But now we need to make it so when we click on these, it actually updates our page. So inside of this jobs pagination, I'm going to create a simple helper function that we can use to get started with. So we can just say that we want a function, which is going to be called adjust page. And we're going to pass it in an amount. And all this is going to do is set page equal to the previous page. And we just want to take the previous page and we want to add in the amount. This is just a nice little helper function that will allow us to update our page based on an amount, whether it's -1, +1, and so on. So in our previous on click, all we want to do is call that function of adjust page, and we pass in -1 because we're going back one page. On here, we're always going to page number 1. So we can just say on click, we're going to come in here and call set page. And we're just going to set it to 1 because we're always going to page number 1. Here, we're doing the exact same thing. It's the previous page. So let's just copy this in. This is just going to go to the previous page. And we click this one down here. We want to go to the next page. So we'll use a +1. And for next, we're again going to use +1 because we're going forward one page. Now, if I save this and I click on this 2 here, you should see that we go to the second page of results and it's loading in. Click 3, we're going to the third page of results. Click 1, we're going to go all the way back to the very first page of results, and so on. So now we have our job cards done, we have our title done, we have pagination done. The last thing to do is to work on this form here for actually querying the different parameters of our API. So in our app.js, this is going to be where we take into account this params here, which so far we haven't used yet. And in order to do this, we're of course going to create a new component, which we're just going to call searchform.js, RFC, and we have our boilerplate code here. And this is going to take in our params, as well as some variable for updating them, which we'll call onParamChange. So now before we go about actually writing the code for our search form, let's implement it into our app. So we can come down here, and we can create first the function for updating our params. We'll call it handleParamChange. This is going to take in an event. And this event is going to come from our input. So every time we change our event, it's going to send this function here. It's going to call this function. So we can get the param we want to change by just saying e.target.name. Whoops. And we can get the value by saying that's e.target.value. And then all we need to do is set our page to 1, because obviously we need to go back to page 1 if we reset our, parameters. So if we search for something, we obviously want to search on the first page and not the 4th page. And then we want to set our params, and we're going to take into account our previous params. Return here a new object where we take all of our current params, so all of our previous params, plus we want to set whatever our new param name is. We're going to set that equal to our value. So this name here, for example, will be description, and we're going to have a key inside params called description, which this is going to access, and we're going to set it to the value, which is whatever we type into this description box here. And this handleParamChange is what we want to pass down to our search form. So let's put our search form in here. We'll say search form. That automatically imported that for us. And then we can just say here that we want to have our params equal to params, and our onParamChange is equal to handleParamChange. And that's everything we need to do to get our search form rendered on our page. So now if we return, for example, hi here, you should see the text hi is going to show up right there, which is exactly what we want. But obviously the text hi is a little ugly, so let's create an actual form. And to do that, we're again going to use Bootstrap, and we're going to import the form component from React Bootstrap. So now inside of here, let's just take our form. We're going to set a class name equal to mb4, just give us a little bit of spacing underneath of our form. And now we're going to create a row. So we can just say form.row. And inside of here, we're going to create a bunch of different form.groups. But we want these form groups to essentially act as columns inside of our row. So we can just say as call here. And all this is doing is essentially saying render this form group as the column component from Bootstrap. So we need to get that column component imported just like this. Now inside of our form group, we can create a label, form.label. and we're just going to say description. And we're going to need an input for that. So we'll say form.control. This is how you create an input with this React Bootstrap library. Our onChange function is going to be that onParam change. So whenever we change this control, it's going to call that function that we created earlier. We also want to set the value equal to params.description. Oops, make sure I spell that properly. There we go. And we also, in order to make this onParam change work, we need to set our name here equal to description, which is exactly the same as the value inside of this params object. So now if we just close that off, set our type to text, and we save, we should see that we now have that description field showing up. And whenever we change this, it's going to change our params. So if we, for example, search for, let's just say that we want to search for Azure. Now we see that only things that involve Azure are actually showing up in our list of results. So if we viewed our details here, there's going to be something about Azure, here something about Azure, and so on. We're able to limit our results to only Azure in this case. Let's just copy this form group, because we're going to do almost the exact same thing, but instead of description, we're going to have location. So we're going to change this to location, and we're going to change our param to location. Now if we save, you should see we have two text boxes. And when we type in, for example, a location, like we typed in Nebraska, you can see we get the only company in Nebraska that has a job listed on this API. And if we delete it, you can see we should get back all of our different job listings. Now the last thing we have is one more form.group. And this one, we're again going to make act as a column. But we actually want to do something slightly different in that we're going to set extra small to auto. And that means that instead of being equal width, for example, this is half the width, this is half the width. And if we create a third column, each of them would all be 1/3 of the full width. This is just a checkbox. We want it to be as small as possible. So auto essentially says, make this checkbox take up the least amount of room as possible. So it doesn't take up a full third of the column. It's just going to take up the least amount of space possible. We're also going to set a class name here, which is ML, and it's going to be 2. We're just going to put a little bit of margin on the left-hand side of it to space it out from this location, since it's going to be as small as possible. Now we can say form.check. That's how we create a checkbox. We're going to do a lot of the same stuff. We're going to set our onChange equal to that onParam change. Our value here is going to be equal to params.full_time, because that's how this GitHub API expects it to be, full_time. It kind of sucks, but we just have to do it. Same thing with name. We need to set that to the exact same string, full_time. And this one we need to set an ID to full time, and that's just so we can link our label up to our actual checkbox. And speaking of label, let's actually set our label to only full time, and this will just give us only full-time jobs. And lastly, this is going to be a checkbox, and we can close this off. Now if we save, you can see we get only full-time showing up, but it's kind of in a weird position. It's way up high for some reason. So instead of a row here, let's set a class name, which is align items end, and that's going to push everything to the bottom, but you can still see it's not quite centered with our text box. And an easy way to fix that is we can just set a class name here of margin bottom 2 on our checkbox, and it's going to put a little margin on the bottom, which lines it up pretty much exactly dead center. Now when we click this, it's going to reload, and it's only going to show us full-time jobs. Unfortunately, most of these are already full-time jobs, so it's hard to see it working, but I promise you that this actually works. And that's all there is to creating this Jobs API page. Again, I want to say a huge thank you to Brad for letting me on this channel. It's an absolute honor to be here talking with you, and I really hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you very much for watching, and have a good day.